Hi everyone, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about how homophobia and heterosexism work. In other words, I want to talk about very specific mechanisms through which these kinds of inequality affect our culture. This is the second episode in the series called Critical Awareness about Homophobia, and you can see this full series on my YouTube channel. But for those of you who didn't watch the first video, I'm gonna give you a quick recap. So what is critical awareness? Critical awareness about any problem is truthfully answering four questions. Where did this problem stem from? How it works? What impact it has? And who benefits from it? And by contrast to simple awareness, which is merely acknowledging that a problem exists, addressing social justice topics with critical awareness gives us real power, which is the ability to effect lasting and meaningful change. And in the previous episode, I talked about the historical roots of homophobia, which is very important, which is where this conversation should start. And today we proceed to the second piece of critical awareness, which is how specifically homophobia and heterosexism work in today's culture. And I gotta tell you that this is gonna be probably the longest and the most substantial episode in the series, because this is where I have a lot of interesting and important information to share. And it's also very easy to understand, and it's important to really be aware of as we walk through our everyday lives. And I respect that y'all give me your time, which is our most coveted and unrenewable resource, and I don't take it for granted. And so in this video today, out of many mechanisms of homophobia and heterosexism that I learned about in my research, I will highlight two biggest and most hurtful mechanisms of homophobia and heterosexism that everybody needs to know and understand. And those are, first, LGBT stereotypes, and second, dehumanization. So let's dive in. Number one, LGBT stereotypes. So what are LGBT stereotypes? These are false notions about LGBT people that our culture promotes and reinforces. And there are many of them, but then again, today I'm going to talk about two core stereotypes that underpin the rest and that inform the basis of the way homophobia and heterosexism work. So the first stereotype is what I call the emasculation/tomboy myth, and the second is the shallowness myth. So let's explore them in detail. So the first one, the emasculation/tomboy myth, it says that homosexuality is inherently emasculating for men or inherently degrading femininity for women. So if you're a gay man, then you're less than a man, and if you're a gay woman, then you're less than a woman. So, it's a very common notion. And let me tell you, someone who grew up in a homophobic country, I also harbored this myth for the majority of my life. Like, I was raised believing that, for example, gay men are all effeminate, and they have this effeminate mannerisms, and that they are biologically defective as men, that they're sexually impotent and infertile. And yes, I know it sounds shocking, but this is how ignorant I was for the majority of my life. Because, growing up in Russia, I didn't have any visibility of people who could controvert the stereotype. And even in my formal education as a doctor, in the country's largest and oldest medical school, I never got any information to basically counter this bullshit, It was like an academic education, and this gives you an idea of the degree of homophobia in this country. But remarkably, this stereotype, this emasculation/tomboy stereotype, it was the exact place from which my homophobia started to tumble down, like a house of cards, basically. So when I was 25, and for the first time of my life, I went on a trip to big Europe, particularly to Barcelona, Spain. There I saw so much social contrast with Russia that just completely overthrew my narrow-minded, distorted vision of the world. And one aspect of that contrast was about gay people. Because, in Barcelona, it was for the first time in my life that I saw absolutely masculine men who were like mentioned every single requirement of male gender stereotype, who at the same time were openly gay. And for me, it was like seeing a UFO. When it was, I remember this very clearly. Like my first day in the city, I'm walking down the street, and I see a couple of guys who look normal and they behave normal, and but like, to be honest, they even look more masculine than the majority of other men, including me. And then all of a sudden, these guys hug and kiss right amidst the street. And the first time I saw it, I literally stopped in my tracks. I just stared at them with a slack jaw, like a moron. And then I go on my way, and then half an hour later, I see another couple like that, and then another one. And at this point, that I realized that I'm the only person staring at them. Because in Barcelona, no one else is staring at gay couples holding hands or kissing in the street any more than they're staring at straight couples. Because Spain, as a nation, has made this remarkable progress on the journey of eradicating homophobia. And I'm not saying that it's over. I'm not saying that there's no discrimination, that there's no homophobic violence in Spain. But the fact that there is a visibility of gay people out in public, like that's a huge, huge deal. Because Spanish kids today don't grow up like I grew up, without seeing the whole range of human diversity. Instead, they grow up in an inclusive society that doesn't just tolerate, but celebrates everyone for who they are, regardless of their color, orientation, or religion. And the experience of seeing gay people in Spain was what effectively controverted this homophobic stereotype that I had always lived with, that being gay by definition implies emasculation for a man or losing femininity for a woman. And the good thing is that instead of just getting angry and stubbornly sticking to this bullshit, denying reality, I got curious. I said, if this thing about gay people that I was taught doesn't represent reality, then maybe other things that I was taught about gay people are also not true. Like, I need to learn more. I need to read some literature. And also, for the 5 days that I was in Barcelona, I paid close attention to every aspect of social reality there that was so different from what I saw, from what I had seen in my entire life in Russia. And I paid close attention because I felt the imperative to expand my perspective, and because social justice had always been a value for me. And I just wanted to know why I had been fed bullshit for my entire life and why truth had been concealed from me by the culture. And years later, after I've done this research and finished my book, what I understand is that this emasculation myth is basically a confusion of sexual orientation and gender identity. Because historically, before late 19th century, we didn't understand either of those concepts. And for sure, we didn't distinguish between them. And it's today that we have clear definitions. So what is sexual orientation? Sexual orientation is what gender you're physically attracted to. And gender identity is what gender do you feel you are? Like, this is answering those questions. And, those things are not necessarily related. So the myth that homosexuality is emasculating for men or degrading femininity in women, it's basically a cultural symptom of heterosexism, because it is predicated on the notion that being sexually attracted to females is an inherent part of masculinity, or being attracted to males is an inherent part of femininity. And so if you're gay and you accept yourself as such, then you have to trade in part of your masculinity or your femininity in order to accept your homosexuality. This is bullshit. The way this bullshit shows up today is not only in homophobic slurs or slogans, that when they target gay men, they are emasculating, or when they target gay women, they diminish those women's femininity. But it even shows up in the behavior of people who are openly gay, because despite the claim that they have accepted themselves, many of them still live with internalized homophobia. They don't have critical awareness about stereotypes that I'm talking about here, and so they're owned by these stereotypes. And so it shows up, for example, in the fact that far too many gay men in the West, men who have access to economic opportunity and middle-class life, never mind those men who are wealthy, they are totally obsessed with gyms and muscles. So they have the biggest prevalence of muscle dysmorphia across all demographics. Because what? By showing off how buffed you are, you're sort of proving to the world that you're male enough. And since gay men, just like all men, have a predominantly visual perception of sexuality, for them, masculinity is mostly about looks, not about behavior. And deep down, they still harbor this scarcity notion about not being male enough. So they hustle for their masculinity instead of believing in it. And so when you hustle, what do? You become obsessed and addicted, and any good aspiration, like the aspiration to be physically fit, is absolutely blown out of proportion. And another remarkable story in this regard, in regard to this myth, is the story of Patricia Velasquez. So, she's a Venezuelan supermodel, an activist, a UNICEF ambassador, just a badass woman. And she's gay. And, she told the story a few years ago that when her modeling career began, just like most female models, she had to wear high heels on the runway. And she had some skeletal issue with her feet. And because of this issue, wearing heels was very painful to her. And then, because of this, she underwent surgeries. And then the pain became even worse. And she lived with this chronic, excruciating pain for many, many years. And in the interview, she said that despite all the pain, she wasn't willing to let go of high heels, even when her employers allowed her to do that, because for her, high heels were a symbol of femininity. And she was sticking to it despite the pain because she couldn't accept herself as a gay woman. So for her, femininity was incompatible with homosexuality. And of course, she had this bullshit in her mind because of the homophobia and heterosexism in the culture that surrounded her. And even in her fashion industry, as LGBT accepting as we believe it is, because it's actually not as accepting as we think it is. And so Patricia's story is such a great contextual example of how gay people, like this is not happening to individuals, but this is happening to gay people in general. Like they're trying to erase or orphan part of their identity because they want to avoid being defined by this emasculation or tomboy stereotype. So they sort of buy into this false dichotomy that they have to choose between being homosexual and belonging in their cisgender identity. And this is complete bullshit because it's not an either-or situation, but it's an and both situation. Like those things are not necessarily related. You can't be gay and you can't be cisgender, and you can't be straight and you can't be at the same time transgender. Those things are not related. So another example of how this myth shows up in the culture is what I call a feminist socialization or tomboy socialization when applied to gay women. Here's what I'm talking about here. It's fact that there are some gay men who are indeed effeminate, as opposed to gay men who are absolutely masculine. There are some gay men who are effeminate. And it's also a fact that there are some gay women who exhibit traits that are culturally viewed as masculine in their looks and their behavior. And, we label them as tomboys. So if it's observable with those people, then the question becomes, for example, for effeminate gay men, does their effeminacy have something to do with the hormones or maybe some other biological aspects? And we have to answer this question honestly, because if we do research on sexuality in a real way, then we have to find data and models that are not conceptual, but that explain and that align with the whole range and diversity of reality, including, for example, the heterogeneity of gay people. And so what I found in research is that when it comes to effeminate gay men or, sort of tomboy gay women, socialization probably plays a huge role here, and that's probably a bigger role than biology. So what it means is that many of those gay men are not effeminate because of their orientation, but they are conditioned to be effeminate by homophobic culture. Because if the culture says to a boy, if you're gay, then you should behave like a girl, you should cry in public, you should play with dolls, or you should wear pink clothes, and the rest of this gender stereotype bullshit. And as a result, many gay people are socialized into roles and behaviors of the gender opposite from their own. Even though this is not an inherent, inevitable aspect of their orientation, but they are socialized in it. And then again, it brings us to how arbitrary gender stereotypes are and how our criteria of masculinity and femininity are largely based on conventions rather than biology. Because things like the length of your hair, or whether you wear makeup or not, what kind of sports you play, or whether you wear skirts or pants, or whether you wear slim fit or loose fit jeans, it has nothing to do with your biological sex. It has to do with our social conventions about masculinity and femininity and our desire to just put people into boxes to sort of do this by gender division of people. And just like any conventions, these are arbitrary and subject to change they're subject to change with the course of history. Because what was considered masculine some time ago, now it's not, and what was considered feminine now maybe not considered feminine 100 years from now. So it's all arbitrary. And so I do really hope that I explained this well enough that that you have understood this myth about emasculation or being a tomboy, that this is a myth, that this is not something that does justice to the experience of homosexual people, because being homosexual has nothing to do with being less of your gender. And it's the notion that it is basically one of the ways that heterosexism and homophobia show up in our culture. And so now let's proceed to the second core myth of homophobia and heterosexism, which is the shallowness myth. So it is the myth that says that same-gender relationships are all about sex, that they are about some perverted form of physical attraction, and therefore there can be no real emotional or spiritual connection between gay people, between people of the same gender. So it's all about lust and it's all about sex, but there can be nothing spiritual about that. And this claim is backed up with the fact that there's a far bigger rate of promiscuity in LGBT people than there is in straight people. And they measure promiscuity as the average number of partners that a person has in a year. Like, for example, this is one of the most common metrics. And so this myth, based on the fact that LGBT people have more sexual partners on average in 1 year, the claim goes that gay love is not real love, that gay love cannot be a committed, monogamous, fully functional romantic relationship. And then this myth comes and stays at the core of societal opposition to gay marriage and gay adoption. The hard thing is that there's no evidence anywhere, including the Bible, that love between two men or two women is inherently less spiritual, less profound, or less committed than love between a man and a woman. And this shallowness stereotype is a classical example of logical fallacy, where we confuse the cause and the effect. Because what's real and undeniable is that, in the culture that we've been witnessing for the last 50 years, when gay people become visible in some progressive parts of the world, we also could see that gay people are actually involved in promiscuity more than straight people. This is real, this is undeniable. But then the question is, why is it so? How do we explain this fact? Because to say that it's because gay people are all shallow and lustful and incapable of committed relationships is one way to look at it. But it's not the only way. And as it turns out, it's not the most truthful way. Because if we just let go of our heterosexual privilege and all the bullshit that comes with it, then it's easy to see that gay and trans people's involvement in promiscuity has been happening as a result of marginalization and denied access to societal infrastructure and, societal institutions where normal, committed, monogamous relationships could be built. Like, we denied them access to those institutions, and that led to their promiscuity. And that also led to the fact that promiscuity became normalized in LGBT community. It's the result of homophobia as the external trauma constantly, historically inflicted on this community. It's not the result inherent in homosexuality. Because when gay people live in a homophobic world, the world where they have to remain excluded and segregated, where they have to hide out and only meet each other in gay bars or gay saunas and only have sex behind closed doors, in a world where they cannot live openly with dignity and safety, then they cannot by definition be vulnerable enough to initiate and build committed, monogamous, fully functional relationships. Because this requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is the greatest casualty of trauma. So if you don't remove the trauma, if you don't integrate gay people back into larger society, if you don't make them feel safe from violence, if you don't give them access to things like marriage and having kids, then how can you expect them to not be promiscuous? Because in a society that is truly equal and free from homophobia and heterosexism, there will be no need for segregation. There will be no such thing as gay bars or gay saunas, because gay people won't be segregated in certain places, but they will be integrated everywhere in the society. So I know that now, for example, if you're someone who owns a gay bar, this might sound like a threat to your business, and I know that this is the reason why. I know this is hard, but I'm going to say it because it's the truth. Like, many gay people in positions of power and gay-oriented businesses actually benefit from homophobia because it secures the cultural segregation of gay people and the subsequent flow of money to those businesses. But in a society that I and many other activists want to build, gay people will be able to meet each other and to build relationships everywhere, just like straight people. And today, only an approximation of that is possible, and only in select parts of the world. Like, for example, gay couples in Starbucks or, marriage equality are the things that you can see in the US or in Canada or Spain or Scandinavian countries, but it doesn't represent what's happening in the majority of the world. And as someone who lives in Russia, I can't even imagine, seeing a gay couple here in this country hold hands in a public place. In my entire life, I haven't seen one. I haven't seen a gay couple that's visible and out. And I can't imagine, having a colleague at my job talk openly about having a relationship with a same-sex partner. Like in Russia and in countries like Russia, those things are unthinkable. Even though gay people exist here, just like they exist, everywhere else. But here, in countries like this, they are closeted and silenced and hiding out, and maybe having sex with random strangers that they find on hookup apps. Then again, risking their physical safety, because on those hookup apps, there are people who actually hunt for gay people in order to perpetrate homophobic violence. And one part of this violence is even state-sponsored. Like I have another video where I talk about that. But the reality is that in countries like mine, in countries like this, gay people don't have access to the life where they could build committed and monogamous relationships. And that's why their sexual activity is about promiscuity. And that's why open gay couples in Spain, seeing them, it just blew up my mind. And the most important thing is that I didn't have to go to a gay bar or a gay sauna or anything gay to see LGBT people. They were visible everywhere, as they should be. And so this shallowness of LGBT people is in fact the consequence of homophobia, but not it can't be a basis for it. It's the effect of homophobia as a cause. And there's no real reason to believe that gay love is any less spiritual, any less functional, or any more lustful than heterosexual love. And like wrapping up this topic of LGBT stereotypes, I want to talk about the construct LGBT lifestyle. So this construct is one of the, I think, biggest part of homophobic rhetoric, and it was so 50 years ago, but it still remains the same way. When like people engage in this homophobic rhetoric, talking about LGBT lifestyle and saying about deviant lifestyle and things like that. And I want to talk about it because even the construct, even the term LGBT lifestyle is utter horseshit. Like, not even the message that people are trying to drive through with this concept, but even the concept itself is utter horseshit. Because to say like gay lifestyle, it makes as much sense as the lifestyle of people with AB4 rhesus negative blood type, or red-haired people's lifestyle, or blue-eyed people's lifestyle. Like, do these people have some special lifestyle? How can an individuality trait inform a lifestyle? It can't. It's bullshit. But what can inform a lifestyle is oppression. And this I know for sure. And the story I remember in this regard very well is, when I was, it was my second year in medical school, and I remember it very clearly, even though I was 18 or 19 years old at that moment. I entered into medical school at a very early age, and it was my second year there, and we were having English class, where we were given an article to translate from English to Russian, and this was the article, very old article, written, some yellow paper with a typewriter, so it was basically it was before the era of computers and printers when this article was, just reprinted for us as students to learn. So it was one of the first articles about HIV virus and AIDS when HIV virus was discovered in early 1980s. And the article was about how horrible this disease was and how it devastated gay populations on the west coast of the U.S. Because the thing is that before, I'm going to give you a little backstory here. Before the virus was discovered, before the HIV was discovered, AIDS was called grits. So it was seen in clinical practice, it was seen that this horrible disease from which young men die, and it is the very rare disease where young men would have this horrible immunodeficiency, but it was called grits, which meant gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. And so it was believed that their immunodeficiency resulted from so-called gay lifestyle, which consisted of drugs and alcohol and some really, really, really harmful and bad habits. And so it was labeled gay lifestyle. And that's why the syndrome was labeled gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome. So it was believed to result from the constant use of drugs and alcohol and also promiscuity. And then the virus gets discovered as the root cause of this disease. And what's the public's reaction to it? That the majority of public those years, it labels this disease as God's revenge to sodomites. So here's the thing, where's truth and where's bullshit in the story? Because the story then went it was the disease that specifically affected gay populations. And that's why it was called God's revenge to sodomites. But where's truth and where's bullshit here? Truth is that among all kinds of sexual activity, unprotected anal sex carries the highest risk of transmission of HIV and a lot of other STDs. This is the truth. This is a biological, immutable fact. But the question is this the reason why gay populations in the west coast of the U.S. were among the first populations and the first demographics to be devastated by AIDS? Is it because of them practicing anal sex as a consequence of their homosexuality? Or is it because of some different reason? Like, I didn't know the answer when I was in my second year of medical school, and no one gave me that answer in my formal education. Over the entire course of my formal medical education, I received zero critical awareness about that. But many, many years later, through my own research and through my own curiosity, I found the answer. I understood that the real reason why gay men historically were the first demographic to be affected by AIDS is not because of anal sex that they practiced, but it was because of extremely high rates of promiscuity. And high rates of promiscuity among gay men, as I explained earlier in this video, were the consequence of homophobia, the consequence of exclusion from larger society, and the consequence of denial of access to societal institutions where committed relationships could be built. So it's because of homophobia, not because of anal sex, that thousands of young gay men died of this epidemic far before any treatment could be found. But then again, when this happened, culturally we associated, and even today many people continue to associate HIV and AIDS with homosexuality. Although now the virus is being predominantly spread by heterosexual people, and when among different kinds of sexual activity, it is mostly spread by heterosexual activities. But we use this association about HIV and homosexuality as another myth to reinforce the construct of LGBT lifestyle and other bullshit concepts that make heterosexism, homophobia, and homophobic violence a continual reality. And so, this leads me to my last point in today's episode, which is dehumanization. So dehumanization, it basically sits just beside LGBT stereotypes in the way that homophobia and heterosexism work. And dehumanization is a mechanism that is common in seemingly unrelated things, like homophobia and human trafficking and the Holocaust. So I have a detailed video about dehumanization, and I'm going to put a link here, and I encourage you all to watch it later. But here I'm going to give you all a short overview of it. So here's the thing. As a social species, we humans are wired, we are neurobiologically wired to protect and care for one another. Like, this is our biological wiring, deeply hard-coded in the brain. And it is because it is the requirement for the survival of our species, because we are a social species. And so things like murder, torture, rape, genocide, those things, they go against our biological nature. They go against our deeply hard-coded biological inhibitions. But if you look at the history of homophobic violence, then you can see things like tortures, and even today you can see things like tortures and castration of gay men, or, punitive rapes of gay women. And so if this goes against our biological hard-coded inhibitions, then the question is, how does this happen? Like, how does it become possible if we're biologically wired to not do it? And the answer is that in the context of homophobic violence, it happens the exact same way as it happened in the context of the Holocaust and, Nazi concentration camps and gas chambers. Because just like the Holocaust, homophobia has dehumanization as one of its core mechanisms. And so here's what it is. Dehumanization is when, by using exclusively language and images, we slowly take one group of people and we slowly but steadily move them out of the realm of human. So we slowly move them out of this circle that is protected by our basic rights and basic morals as human beings. And we condition ourselves to do it. And this is how we subvert our deeply hard-coded biological inhibitions to not hurt our fellow human beings. Because when we see someone as less than human, then it becomes okay to violate their physical safety. And and it happened in the Nazis' history, because for years before the Holocaust began, the media that were controlled by Nazis, they portrayed Jews as snakes and rodents, and and then we get this whole concentration camps and gas chambers thing. And it's the same thing with homophobia, because when gay people are portrayed in the culture as some weird animals, as some, side effects of the evolution, as it happens in today's Russia, then it becomes okay to torture them or to castrate them. And this is horrible, but this is reality. Like, this is how it works. Through dehumanization, we can normalize violence, and we can normalize things that are absolutely unthinkable, and that, in retrospect, when we look at things like Holocaust, they make, the hairs on our necks prickle with horror. But this is what happened, and this is what was perpetrated by human beings just like ourselves. This is the power of dehumanization. And then, the hardest question here is, why do we need to know about this? Like, why do we need to know? And why do we need to talk about this? Like, why do we need to grow awareness about this? How does, it's also hard and uncomfortable and horrible, but how does this understanding inform our power? And the answer is, once we deeply and wholly understand the mechanisms of any kind of oppression, be it racism or sexism or homophobia or classism, we can also understand how we can block these mechanisms in order to stop these things from happening in the culture. Because, as I told in one of my videos, the long-lived and big social problems, they require multimodal approach. This is why we need critical awareness. We need to understand the root causes, the mechanisms, the impacts, and people who benefit from this problem. We need to understand all those things, because our activism needs to be targeted at all these 4 levels. So we first need to, of course, counter the historical roots of homophobia, and then we need to understand the mechanism of homophobia in order to block them, and then we need to know about the impact, to remedy the impact, and then we also need to know about people who benefit from it in order to hold them accountable. So when it comes to these kind of problems, it's an imperative to address them at multiple levels, not at just one level, because otherwise our fight will not be effective. And so I, a while ago made a commitment to never talk about any problem without offering a solution. So when I told you about the ways that homophobia works, I'm also going to tell you what I think about how can we address these ways, and how can we address these mechanisms in order to block homophobia and heterosexism and to eliminate them from our culture at this particular level. So let me begin with this. How do we address dehumanization? The answer to this, it has 2 equally important parts. The first is how we address dehumanization in general, and the second part is the second question is, how do we address the dehumanization of gay people specifically? So the general part is, how dehumanization always starts with language and images. And so the way that we address it is by resisting the urge to use dehumanizing language when we describe people that we don't agree with, people that we don't like for some reason, or people who even hurt us or who oppress us. We don't use dehumanizing language when talking about these people. We ourselves stop using dehumanizing language, as tempting as it is. And let me tell you, as someone who grew up in Russia, in this culture, for example, dehumanizing language is very common, very normalized. So there are so many people here who use words like pigs, dogs, deers, apes to describe others that they dislike or disagree with. And I have to say that very frequently these words are used with a racist connotation, towards non-white people who come here from Soviet Union countries. So we have our own kind of racism here. And I've used this language too for the majority of my life before I understood how dangerous it is and what horrible processes are reinforced when I engage in this language. And so, today I can tell you that I am adamantly opposed to dehumanization of any person. Like, no matter how much I dislike this person, and no matter how much I hate what this person does or says. So even when I hear that the President of the United States uses dehumanizing terms towards women, and I'm completely outraged, but I'm still adamantly opposed to calling the President of the US a pig or talking about his kids as animals, because it contributes nothing. It only perpetuates hatred, and it only, it's emotional offloading. It's offloading our anger, but it contributes nothing to real conversation. Or if you're an anti-racist activist and you want to call Donald Trump out for his white supremacy, and then in order to do it, you call Donald Trump a pig, or you call man who showed up in Charlottesville in 2017 white trash. The real thing is that when you do that, you're repeating the very same process of dehumanization that historically enabled slavery in America. Because that's the thing. You become what you hate. Because dehumanization, name-calling, shaming, all of that is not a tool to hold people accountable or call for social justice. It's only a way to offload our anger, and it perpetuates hate instead of stemming it. And this is what we can do about dehumanization in general, just not do it ourselves. But aside from avoiding dehumanization ourselves and also showing zero tolerance for dehumanizing language when other people use it, what are some additional steps to specifically counter the dehumanization of LGBT people? So, first of all, call people out when you hear it. So when you hear people, no matter straight or gay, use terms that diminish the humanity and inherent dignity of gay and trans folks, even in jokes, even humorously, call attention to it. And don't lean to people from the position of self-righteousness, but approach them from the position of curiosity and generosity, ask questions. Say things like, you said this word, help me understand why you use this word. Do you really understand what this word means and what the usage of this term can lead to? Let's have a conversation about this. And the second step is, and this is something that I have personally started to practice recently, I change my own language when I'm talking about gay and trans people. So specifically when I talk about gay people, I no longer use words gay and lesbian as nouns. Because in Russian, they are almost exclusively used as nouns, but in all languages that I speak, I stopped using them as nouns. And instead, now I only use them as adjectives. And I think this is hugely, hugely important, because what is a noun? Another word for noun is a substantive. So it's something that represents the substance or the essence of the person or the thing that it describes. A table, a car, or, a person. By contrast, adjective is something that represents the attribute of the thing or person that it refers to. For example, a wooden table, a black car, or a red-haired person. And so, gay and lesbian should be adjectives, because sexual orientation, just like hair color or eye color or blood type, doesn't represent the essence or the identity of a person, but it represents just an attribute of that person. And the reason why it's important in regards to dehumanization is because when I say a gay man instead of a gay, or a lesbian woman instead of a lesbian, then I emphasize the humanity of this person, So I block dehumanization at the exact place where it usually begins, which is language. Because once you dismiss the humanity of a person and turn their attribute into their identity, then violence is within an arm's reach. So when you, for example, make the transition from a lesbian woman to a lesbian, then it's very easy to just go further and from a lesbian go to a butch, and then from a butch to a bitch, and then from a bitch to a dog. And when it's a dog, then it's okay to murder, torture, and rape, because it's no longer a human. And so those things become possible. And so this is how I see we can prevent the dehumanization of gay people. This is one of the ways that I have started to operationalize. And please, if you have some other ideas on this, please do leave me a comment here. I would love to have a conversation about that, because this is, for me, it's something that is constantly an area of curiosity, something where I try to do some research and where I try to find new ways and try to find new ideas. So it will be awesome if we talk about this. But, just coming to the end of this video, now that we've talked about how we can address the dehumanization of LGBT people as one of the mechanisms of homophobia, heterosexism, one of the main mechanisms, then I want to wrap this up with just saying a couple of words about how we can address LGBT stereotypes. So, if you're straight, then please have an eye for these stereotypes in the way you think and talk about gay and trans people, and the way you treat gay and trans people, and the way you see their experiences. And, also, that's very important. Talk about these stereotypes with other straight folks when you see them operating on these stereotypes, when you see them operating on these myths. But if you're gay, then, or if you're trans, it also is important for you to grow awareness about the stereotypes and to understand how they work. Because, especially if you're openly gay, if you're living in countries where if you live in a country where you can be openly gay and you're out, then people watch your behavior and they watch your lifestyle. And so you have the responsibility to challenge the stereotypes that comprise a huge, huge part of homophobia. So you have the responsibility to challenge the stereotypes instead of reinforcing them. And I find this mistake especially common in Western gay people who live in the public eye and who are famous, like politicians or celebrities, because by being unaware of these stereotypes, they exhibit behaviors, actions, and choices that are publicly visible, that reinforce negative LGBT stereotypes and thus reinforce homophobia. But they don't understand that their status and their privilege keep them exempt and keep them very far from the exposure to the trauma that the majority of their community continues to face on a daily basis. And when they, by their behavior, just reinforce the stereotypes, then they also, sort of throw on more gasoline to the fire of homophobia that hurts the majority of their community. But they do not feel that harm because they're protected by their status and their privilege. And I think we need to be having more conversations about this. And we need to be having more conversations about how gay people in positions of power and privilege and, who have visibility and influence, how they have the biggest responsibility about controverting LGBT stereotypes instead of reinforcing them. So, thank you all for listening today. Thank you all for joining me. As I promised, it's the longest and the most substantial episode in this series, Critical Awareness about Homophobia. And so I thank you all for your time. I know it's been a lot. And I would love to have a conversation with y'all about this. So, please leave me a comment below. If you find this video helpful or insightful, please share it with your friends. And also, don't forget to subscribe. So I will catch you next time on Horror's YouTube channel. Thanks for being with me. Show up, be brave, say the truth, and bye.